Hey, good morning, class. Welcome in. We are going to take a look at our third and final discussion for Chapter 9. So far, we've taken a look at perfect competition, we've taken a look at monopolies, oligopolies, and monopolistic competition. Well, now we have to understand that when all this is occurring in our world, our day to day, there is government involvement. There has to be. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why we'll see government intervention. So let me talk about that. Then, underclassmen, I'm going to introduce the final project. We're going to have another activity that's going to go along with this. But seniors, you don't have to worry about any new work. So let's get through this discussion, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, so let's talk about antitrust legislation and mergers. So after the rise of big business in the late 1800s, U.S. government officials took the initiative to break up the monopolies. Your Standard Oil, your steel, and your railroads, the ones we've talked about. John D. Rockefeller, who ran Standard Oil, created what we call interlocking directorates. These are a board of directors who also serve as the board of directors for competing companies. So essentially, he's trying to monopolize anything that he can. Thus, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was created to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraint and monopolies. So we're seeing some pushback against these big businesses. Now, what is antitrust legislation? So antitrust legislation is federal and state laws passed to prevent new monopolies from forming and to break up those that already exist. Because of the Sherman antitrust law in its infancy, it was kind of vague, difficult to understand. A modified law known as the Clayton Act of 1914 was installed. This prohibited or limited a number of very specific business practices that limited competition substantially. So what does it do? It prevents these big corporations from controlling every aspect of the market. Now, understand this. There are also mergers. Most antitrust laws deal with restricting the harmful effects of a merger. A merge occurs when two or more companies combine into one corporation. There are three types of mergers. There's horizontal, vertical, and conglomerates. So with a horizontal merger, this involves businesses that make the same product or produce similar services. So back in the day, again, a horizontal merger would be like your video store. So like a Blockbuster would merge with your mom and pop shop video store. That would be what we call a horizontal merger. Vertical mergers, this takes place when firms take part in different types of the manufacturing process, different steps of the manufacturing process. So what do we mean by this? So oil and gas companies, great example. So oil and gas, you take a look at essentially where they're drilling the oil, okay, where they're going to refine that oil, and then when they're going to distribute that oil. All of that is a vertical merger. And lastly, we have conglomerates. So you may have heard this term in earth science, which is kind of a mixed mash of different types of rock. But a conglomerate in the corporate world, again, is where we have a large corporation made up of smaller corporations that deal with unrelated businesses. One of the best examples of a modern conglomerate would be Sony. Okay, so Sony is a modern conglomerate. Okay, so let's take a look back at government regulation. Besides antitrust laws, there are several government agencies in place that regulate business pricing and quality. However, in the 1980s and the 1990s, a wave of deregulation was used in Washington. So what is deregulation? So it's reduction of government regulation and control over business activity. So when we look back at that Enron documentary, they thrived on that deregulation. Their energy corporation was able to take advantage of this and take their company to big-time heights, even though we knew it was a scam and they were basically messing up the entire system. And they were the ones that got caught. So essentially with deregulation, again, it opened the door for a lot of these businesses to boom. And that's why we saw in the 1990s just a massive economic boom, okay? So with that being said, again, deregulation does lead to a lot of issues, okay? And deregulation has been rather troubling in years past. Okay, so to wrap up today's lecture, again, pretty quick, short and sweet, we're going to take a look at federal regulatory agencies. So there are four main ones, some of which you may have heard of. These are things that we want to talk about that are important to understand that we need these in our day-to-day life. So the first one is the FDA. So the Food and Drug Administration, all right, regulates purity and safety of foods, drugs, and cosmetics. And as you can imagine, this kind of stems from, if you can think back to the jungle, right? Upton St. Clair, looking at the nastiness of the meat packing industry. All right, we have to have good food. We got to make sure that our food is healthy enough to eat. The drugs that we're taking are not going to make us sick. The cosmetics that we're applying to our body are not going to, leave breakouts and that kind of thing. So you have to have some regulation there. We also have the FCC, all right, so the Federal Communications Commission. Now, this group you may have heard of as well. They're going to regulate television, radio, telegraph, and telephone. Telegraph, not so much anymore. Most recently, this group regulates your TV satellite and your cable, and as you can imagine, they're also getting into your streaming. So when I think FCC, I always think of Eminem's verse back in the early 2000s, the FCC won't let me be. So essentially, again, with all of his music, anyone that creates music that requires parental advisory, it's got to go through the FCC. And they have an oversight as to what can be shown, what can be heard on TV, radio, internet, that kind of thing. We have the SEC. We've talked about the SEC a little bit, not the Southeastern Conference for our athletic conference and then also for college sports. But the SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission. So this regulates the sale of stocks, bonds, and other investments. So their job is to go in and make sure that Wall Street is not doing shady things. However, as we know, that has happened time and time again. So the SEC is there to essentially make sure that Wall Street and the stock market is running smoothly. And lastly, we have one that's really been in the news a lot, and that is the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency. This develops and enforces environmental standards for air, water, and toxic waste. And obviously, in the era that we're living in with global warming and climate change as a day-to-day kind of thing, the EPA has a major role. EPA has to go in and make sure that your factories are not producing too much pollution, your businesses are not dumping things into rivers and lakes. So again, the EPA is there, and they have a large responsibility, especially moving forward as we're going to continue to see industrialization at a fast rate. So these are all things we want to take a look at, and these, again, are federal regulatory agencies. All right, so with that being said, I want you folks to have a great day. We're going to have activity number 2 in just a little while. I hope you guys have an awesome week, and I will see you next time. All right, bye, everybody.